last but definitely not least is Sue Dibb, who is literally, when we asked her to come, she was merely Brighton and Hove Food Partnership. Now she is also the new head of the Food Ethics Council. So Sue, you're going to address sustainable diets.
Yes, thank you for that introduction, and I'm delighted to be taking up my new role in the new year as the Executive Director of the Food Ethics Council, and look forward to engaging with you on many of these issues. So thank you for that introduction. Sustainable diets, yes, I'm really aware that you're probably thinking about what your diet is going to be at lunchtime, and I'm sure it will be sustainable. So I won't keep us too long. It will indeed. So, and I'm following Tim's headings. You know, what's the state of play? Why is it important? And running through his headings on that. So, about policy, what's happening, what's not, and what needs to happen. So, why is it important? You know, a sustainable diet's just a nice to have for the good times. Well, no, certainly they're not. Shifting diets towards more sustainable diets is an essential element of our transition to sustainable food production and consumption. And it's necessary if we're going to meet the multiple challenges of feeding a growing global population, while at the same time needing to stop dangerous climate change, tackle obesity and diet-related ill health, and prevent the continuing degradation of natural resources that supply our food systems. And we can't do that unless we enable that transition to sustainable diets, not just here in the UK, but globally too. And most of the emphasis has largely been on production, and that's important. But what's important is also looking at consumption. The two are intricately linked, and we need to think about consumption and how to enable us all in relation to more sustainable diets. It's a relatively recent policy debate and policy concept and policy recognition. And so if thinking about, well, what is the state of play as regards this policy area? Well, there has been progress in understanding and recognising the need to move towards consumption and move our consumption towards more sustainable diets. It's a dialogue that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It's a language which you in this room may be familiar with. That's not to say it's familiar out there in the world when most people are putting their weekly shop together. They may be thinking about health, and we know that many more people are thinking about health. And many more people are thinking about maybe elements of what comprises a sustainable diet, but you won't find it necessarily resonating that language or that concept with most people yet out there in the world. So whilst there is progress on understanding and recognising this, I think there's been far less progress on the solutions. And one of the first challenges to think about is defining sustainable diets. What do we mean when we talk about sustainable diets? It does encompass the whole gamut of social, environmental, economic issues that relate to food. It's the whole picture. And particularly this issue has come to the forefront in thinking about the need to integrate the focus on health and environmental sustainability. That's not to say that there aren't many other important issues in here, but that's where the focus has largely been. And this did emerge as quite a strong theme in the last administration's policies through Food Matters and Food 2030. And this is also part of a policy theme, the wider acknowledgement of the role that food plays in sustainable consumption more broadly. It accounts for broadly 30% of our household footprint, alongside energy use in our homes, in terms of transport and travel. And if we think about how sustainability in relation to our homes and energy use in our homes and in relation to transport, you know, there are major government policies in this area. But when we look at food, there's been far less recognition in terms of sustainability, and far less recognition of the significant impact that changes in our consumption can make towards important targets, not least on climate change reduction. So previously I was at the Sustainable Development Commission. Tim was the lead commissioner there on food before we were abolished as part of the bonfire of the quangos. And one of the pieces of work that the Sustainable Development Commission did was looking at, well, if we wanted to start defining sustainable diets more clearly, what would be the priority areas for action, the areas that would have the greatest impact, the areas that, if policy focused on these, most change could be made. And we worked with Mike Rayner and his team at Oxford University and came up with 3 priority areas. The first is around reducing meat and dairy consumption, probably the most challenging of areas to even have a conversation about sometimes in policy arenas. The second area was about cutting food waste. And the third one was reducing consumption of processed fatty and sugary foods. So we advocated that and took that forward, and there has been a lot of interest, that report following on from this. We've seen, the Council of Food Policy's advisors at that time, before they were also abolished, said this is an important area. And we've seen work by the WWF and the Rowett Institute to look at the Eat Well plate. Could they practically take the Eat Well plate and look at that from an environmental sustainability point of view? Where are the synergies? And our work and their work has found that there are many win-wins. That's not to say there aren't challenges, but in the broader picture, there are many win-wins between a diet that's good for us and a diet that's good for our planet. And the Food Ethics Council with WWF have also taken some of that work forward in terms of dialogues with the industry, livestock dialogues work, to actually show that it is possible to have conversations in tricky areas with the meat and dairy industries, where there is acknowledgement that this is an issue. And that's obviously work that the Food Ethics Council is going to continue to take forward. And a lot of interest now in Europe as well. Tim, I know, travels far and wide talking about sustainable diets with his SDC hat on, and I'm sure continues to do so. The Swedish government made an attempt back in 2008 to bring this to EFSA's attention, but that actually had to be withdrawn when there were some criticisms from member states that advice to eat locally sourced foods could contravene the free flow of goods within the European market. So that had to go back to the drawing board. But there is a lot of interest from researchers in this area now, a great deal of academic research starting to be done in this area. For example, something I was looking at yesterday, the Vienna University of Technology has examined the environmental impacts of switching to a healthier diet by reducing meat consumption by half. And that would not only reduce the area of land required for production by nearly 30%, but it would also reduce per capita greenhouse gases by 35%. So we are starting to see evidence coming forward, starting to see research in this area. But are we starting to see behaviour change? Well, that's perhaps a harder picture to pass judgment on. Euromonitor, doing a report on European and North American markets, they do actually say that they are seeing an increasing the numbers of people in those markets eating a low meat diet. Between 2005 and 2000, sales apparently meat sales grew at less than 14%, so they're obviously still growing, but what they're saying is that's growing at a lesser rate than other areas. Perhaps more depressing was that it was only vegetable consumption which grew at an even lower rate of 11%. So if we're thinking about shifting consumption away from meat and dairy to a more vegetable-based consumption, that doesn't seem to be part of that picture. Lots of interest then in, a kind of standard approach is, how can we help consumers? Do we have to have a label? And quite a lot of conversation around the idea of, is this something that we can do on labels? Conversation around omni standards. Is it possible? Is it possible to have some kind of traffic light system around sustainability? Quite a lot of interest, but sort of stumbles really at the practicalities. And there's also the bigger question about whether we really need labelling here, or do we just need supply chain changes in the supply chain to ensure that it isn't just down to consumers at the end of the day having to make those choices based on a label. So moving on to relevant policies, current and emerging. Well, I think it's fair to say that in terms of meat and dairy, policy progress has been slow. The focus has been on production, on efficiencies in the supply chain. But in terms of policies in relation to consumption, really that's not been an issue that government's previous administration, or even certainly the current one, feel that they want to take on board at the moment. It had a low profile in Food 2030, and currently it doesn't seem to be on the certainly on the government's list of priorities. You know, they're happy for others out there to be talking about this, and in fact under the previous administration, when we spoke to DEFRA about DEFRA actually funded the work that the Sustainable Development Commission did on sustainable diets, but when we talked to them about, you know, maybe jointly statement, or at the time of the launch, you know, that was a pretty no-go area. You know, we were comms people, you know, said, well, you know, we have a challenge here. We have a vegetarian minister. What we don't want to have is a headline that in the Daily Mail that says, you know, vegetarian minister tells people not to eat meat. Unfortunately, they did get that headline because I think the previous version of the report must have been leaked to a journalist somewhere, and which actually did have a stronger recommendation in this respect, but that didn't actually appear in the final report. So, you know, he got the bad headline anyway. But, you know, that just indicates the kind of concern that ministers have, and, you know, we've seen that around telling people what to do, the nanny state, which is how this whole conversation has largely been framed in terms of government policy so far. And as has previously been said, DEFRA's business plan for 2011-2015 talks about a shifting emphasis in its priorities towards production. So again, less emphasis on sustainable consumption, and less emphasis on this joining up, this integrated policy advice, integrated advice, that piece of work that actually was going to happen was stopped when the FSA's role was changed and it was deemed not necessary. So, you know, I was looking on websites the other day for what advice is there out there for consumers. Well, on an NHS website somewhere you'll find lots of good stuff around, you know, healthy eating. You'll find something on a direct, you won't find anything on the DEFRA website, but you'll find something on the Direct Gov website about, you know, greener, healthier, greener living, which says very little about health. And actually, when it talks about climate-friendly diets, there's no mention at all of even the idea that, you know, that meat and dairy is even relevant to that. So a long way from having a sort of joined-up information coming from government around the issue of sustainable diets. So the gaps, what are the gaps here? Well, I think there's a big gap around policy responses in this area. There's also gaps in the evidence. We know a lot about the big picture, and I think my view is that even though we need more research on the detail, the devil is in the detail, and there are complexities. No one would deny that. But that we shouldn't wait until we have the perfect evidence before being able to share what we do know and helping raise awareness of this, because, you know, we know that it takes many years sometimes to actually get the kind of policy responses, the kind of awareness in the public and throughout the industry that will help build that pressure for change. It takes many years. It's unlikely to happen overnight. So we need to start continue to make sure that information is shared and out there. I think another problem is that if we look at, and I'm aware that sustainable diets is much bigger than just looking at climate change, but actually if you look at the climate change targets that this government is committed to, they are production-based rather than consumption-based. So actually we do not have legally binding legally binding targets that are consumption-based. So that is also a gap in terms of, well, where is it that we want to get to? You know, if you don't know where you want to get to, you don't know how far you've got towards it. And that brings me on to measurement as well. What is it that we need to be measuring, and the indicators? I think in terms of business responses, well, I think it depends very much on the issue. You know, some elements of a sustainable diet, you know, we've seen good progress on, or, you know, I'm just thinking of the sustainable fish issue. You know, that's very much been brought into the public's attention, and we are seeing changes in it. But we know on the meat and dairy issue, for example, that, you know, whilst people in industry are very aware of the evidence, it's not something they feel yet ready to be able to have a conversation with their customers about. So what's my verdict? Well, I think there is this policy vacuum, and I think one of the questions is where is the leverage, and how can this issue be framed to meet the current political agendas? We are living in a time of austerity around food. The big issue now is about rising food prices, and, you know, one of the questions that I think has been thrown back to many of us is, what is the challenge of aligning sustainable diets with this new austerity? Won't it cost more? How can we, at this time, be asking people to pay more for food when actually they have less money available for food? And we know that that's the reality for many people. That's an issue I think that the conversation needs to continue with, because it is a complex one. Do sustainable diets need to cost more? And WWF have done some work in this area that shows it doesn't have to. And whilst commodity prices and prices for individual foods have been rising steeply, and will continue to do so most likely, when we're talking about diets, you know, you can reconfigure your diets in many ways. So what would a sustainable and affordable diet look like as well? And we know that actually consumption of sustainable diets and access is an equally important issue to the money in everybody's pocket. So I can't really do full justice in the time here to this issue, but, you know, I think we need to think about the issue of food poverty very much today, and I like the comments earlier which were equating the issue of food poverty to if we have the same attention on food poverty as we have on fuel poverty. I think that's something that we need to put on the agenda fairly and squarely today. We have a minister for fuel poverty. I don't know who the minister for food poverty is, for example, who'd put their hand up as a minister and want to claim responsibility. But I'm digressing a little bit there from the issue of sustainable diets. So finally, well, what do I think should happen? I do think it's important to keep up that outside track pressure. As I said earlier, it takes time. I don't think we've got a particularly receptive policy environment at the moment to this issue. But we do know that governments and policymakers are receptive ultimately to building external pressure. And I think those of us in the room who are part of that outside government role need to continue this conversation and how we can work together to take that forward. Of course, you know, we do have opposition parties. We've got the Labour and Lib Dems, both of whom I think are interested in what their own particular food policies might be, so there's opportunities there. And food procurement is another area, of course, that's always important. As was mentioned earlier, the government buying standards are not particularly strong in this area, and organisations like Sustain and others are doing great work in pushing for that, but that's another important area in which to get not only healthy standards but sustainability standards into public sector food procurement. And not least, the role of business here as well. So the Food Ethics Council, I shall look forward to continuing those conversations with business as well. Thank you, Chair.